Thanks. Thanks, Fauna and Alicia. Thank you very much, Alicia. I guess you can't be an igneous geochemist for too long without having some sort of interest in lithium. For me, really, it was trying to understand the contradiction between us having so much lithium and just about every lithium paradigm there is out in the world that tells us where we should be looking for lithium. Now, when you look at lithium paradigms, they divide between two broad categories. The first are the anatectic models, and these basically suggest that we derive pegmatites straight out of a pile of rocks undergoing limited partial melting. These remain quite controversial, and they almost certainly are not relevant to pegmatites in at least the Western Australian Archean cratons, where we do tend to see typically quite good, quite convincing associations between regional granites and pegmatites. So the other group are granite fractionation models, and these have been heavily biased over the last few years by case studies of systems that are post-Archean. And they basically suggest that you get a big sequence of metasedimentary rocks, you bury it, you subject it to high pressures, you melt them, and you produce S-type granites. And that these undergo a series of fractionation processes to the extent that they're finally capable of separating into something capable of producing a lithium pegmatite. So herein lies the problem or the paradox. The giant lithium pegmatites that we have in Western Australia are currently the world's highest producer of hard rock lithium by a long shot, by at least 1.5 times the nearest rival. But if you look at our geochemistry, our granite geochemistry databases, which are also the most extensive and largest in the world, and you look at the combined geological knowledge of the evolution of the Australian Archean cratons, neither of those actually provide any evidence for S-type granites or for metasedimentary sequences that might ever have been in a situation where they may have produced S-type granites. So I guess, the models have the S-type granites and we have the lithium, which is great for us, but there must be something in there that we can try and understand and turn into ways of finding more lithium. So I'll just talk a bit about S-type granites for those that don't know what they are. S stands for supercrustal or mainly sedimentary sourced granites. These tend to be these are a bit more aluminous. They have an aluminium excess, and that excess is measured by a measure we refer to as the aluminium saturation index. And that's the molecular ratio of aluminium to calcium plus potassium plus sodium. So in other words, these things have more aluminium than they require to fix all the calcium, sodium and potassium in feldspars. And the reason that happens is because they melt sources that are absolutely full of clay. And as a result of that, they're periluminous, so they sit above an aluminium saturation index of 1, typically above 1.1, and their whole fractionation sequence never takes them below that line. And they contrast starkly with just about every other type of granite, so all your A types and all your I types that start off with metaluminous compositions and fractionate towards more luminous compositions. So in both our Archean cratons, our pegmatites are demonstrably associated, do seem to be temporally and spatially associated with voluminous granites, but these in every case represent what are referred to as our low calcium leucogranites. And when we look at those, these are all the red and the greens. The reds are from the Pilbara. The yellows are from the Yilgarn. You see that some of these, whilst some of these are strictly periluminous, they're at high silica values. And if you look towards what their parental rocks might have looked like, they extrapolate back to metal luminous compositions. So these, again, they're not S-type granites. In fact, a lot of these are have more affinities with A-type granites. So that means that either these granites aren't related to the lithium pegmatites, and that if that's the case, then we've got to start sort of thinking again about the evil anatectic models, or they are related to the pegmatites, and there's something wrong with the prevailing lithium paradigms, the models, the exploration models that suggest we need to look for S-type sources. No crustal source for granite will contain minerals that have lithium as a stoichiometric component. Lithium in granitic source regions is housed almost entirely in the micaceous minerals. And of those, it's primarily, overwhelmingly in biotite. So I'd suggest that the only critical component in the sedimentary source model for lithium pegmatites is the fact that that source crystallised at some stage a very high proportion of biotite, and that biotite either retains or it captures lithium, depending on whether the lithium was already there or whether it was brought into the system. And that's how the sedimentary source model works in the first place. So if you're in the situation where you don't have any sedimentary basins, any sedimentary rocks, then we have to start looking for an alternative biotite-rich source. So let's go to the Archean. All right, so these two maps show most of the large lithium pegmatites in the Yilgarn Craton and up in the central part of the Pilbara. And what we notice about the large pegmatites is that they're structurally controlled. We're typically structurally controlled within greenstone belts, but very, very close to the contact between the greenstone belts and the major granitic, the seas of granite. But if you look at the lithium and the low calcium granites, the low calcium Luca granites that we suspect might be related to the pegmatites, they dominate. They hate greenstones, and they dominate the granitic seas in between the greenstone belts. But if you look at in detail at the lithium contents of these granites, you'll find that the low calcium granites that have the anomalous lithium always occur, or in most cases, occur very, very close to the contacts with the granites as well. So, and that's just shown in this graph here, which suggests that within 10 kilometres of a greenstone belt, you've captured around 80% of the granites that have lithium anomalies. Now, that's a really interesting observation, because we're not talking about lithium pegmatites here, we're talking about lithium granites, right? And what that's actually telling us is that the granite source regions in the areas close to the greenstone belts, the granite source regions have been primed. That they've inherited a lithium speciality, which is a very interesting observation. There's another interesting feature of the low calcium granites that have these lithium anomalies, and that's that they're isotopically unusually juvenile, right? So compared to an otherwise compositionally similar low calcium granite out in the middle of one of these granite seas, those that have lithium anomalies have isotopic compositions, and so this is just an epsilon neodymium diagram. They have isotopic compositions that are more akin with mantle-derived rocks than they are with typically felsic components. In fact, so on this graph here, the low calcium granites that we have neodymium data for are the small pink points. Those that are anomalous with lithium are these big red fellas up here, and they actually have isotopic compositions that are very, very similar to sanukitoids, and I don't think that's at all coincidental. So I guess if anyone over the last 10 years has heard me talk about anything, it's about sanukitoids. So Sinucatoids, we all know by now, they're derived through melting of a metasomatized mantle source, and they're a very important feature of the late stage evolution of a lot of greenstone belts in Western Australia, both in the Yilgarn and up in the Pilbara. And what we have here is a neodymium isotope, a contoured neodymium isotope map of the Yilgarn craton. And so this map basically shows you the isotopic characteristics of the granite source regions throughout the Yilgarn craton. It's got nothing to do with the greenstone belts at all. It just shows us about the compositions of the granite source regions. But these anomalies here, these juvenile anomalies that we see in greens and yellows, those areas actually encompass and surround the greenstone belts, and these anomalies can be accounted for almost entirely in terms of the granite source regions having incorporated a large proportion of sinucatoid. And we know that these sinucatoids intruded in the few tens of million years up to when we started getting the low calcium granites and the lithium pegmatites. So this is showing us that the compositions for these lithium enriched granites, not only lithium enriched, they're enriched in a very primitive component which they gain those lithium, those features by melting source regions in proximity to the greenstone belts. So we can see the same up in the Pilbara. This is the central part of the Pilbara. We've got the highly evolved eastern part of the Pilbara. The central part of the Pilbara is isotopically, again, very, very juvenile. It's also full of sinucatoids. And the pattern we see here is measured in the leucogranites that are sourced from regions that are infused by sinucatoids. And again, here are all the big, giant lithium pegmatites. So the other interesting thing about sinucatoids is that they also represent the most hydrated magmas that we know of in the Archean. And so as soon as these things intrude into the crust and start rising, they reach vapor saturation straight away, and they continue to exhale fluids all the way up. And what this does to the country rock is produce vast quantities of biotite altered country rock. And we actually see this even at the surface. If you look in the aureoles of a lot of the sinucatoids, you'll find conspicuous biotite alteration. When you analyse some of those zones, you typically find that they can have up to several hundred ppm lithium. So this is exactly what we need. This is a biotite-rich source that also has an intrinsic enrichment in lithium. So this is what we've basically come up with. Every talk has to have a phantasmogram. So what we suggest is happening is in the residuals of whatever thermal anomaly produced the greenstone belts, we continue to get melting in the mid to lower crustal regions. This is where the leucogranites mainly come from. This is when the first leucogranites start to be produced, but at the same time we're getting melting in the lithospheric mantle, and that's where the sinucatoids come from. These are actually rising through the crust, and you'll see a nice blue stipple over some of these. That's meant to represent biotite alteration of the country rock. So this produces quite conspicuous zones of biotite alteration in the root zones of the greenstone belts. That alteration, you can get a sinucatoid. They occur over tens of millions of years, so there'll be occasions when sinucatoids alter sinucatoids, if you like. At about 2665, when you start to get the more evolved low calcium leucogranites, that's telling us that the biotite dehydration, the stage, the crustal level at which you can get biotite dehydration melting, has risen, and fauna will continue on that a bit later, I think. And so now your melting zones are at a much lower crustal level, or higher crustal level, within the zone of altered sinucatoids, and where that coincides with regions of of extensive biotite alteration, you produce low calcium granites that have these intrinsic enrichments in lithium. Where it occurs away from the greenstone belts, where you haven't had the biotite alteration, then the granites you produce are free of, or essentially poor in lithium. So the fact that we don't get sedimentary source regions to lithium granites in the Australian Archean certainly doesn't represent a problem. It can't represent a problem because we've got the lithium pegmatites. So it's obviously not a problem. The problem is actually identifying an alternative source that fits with the geology that we see in the Archean cratons. And we at the moment are reasonably convinced that this is a better paradigm for lithium pegmatites than the prevailing ones. That's it.